So, an archaeologist, a librarian, a web developer, a taxonomist, and a horse racing enthusiast. Wait, no, this is not a setup for some kind of dumb bar joke. However, it does describe our special guest expert for this content strategy learning session. Lisa Grimm is all of those things and so much more. Over the next few minutes, we'll be learning about the importance of well-described and well-categorized content in digital asset management systems. You'll find out how you and your clients can avoid a hellish experience. Welcome to I Love Content. I'm your hostess, Laura Bergells, and with me is co-host Scott Smith. And our special guest today is Lisa Grimm. Lisa is a trained archaeologist and librarian. She's been directing digital asset management, taxonomy, and content programs in the US and the UK since the 1990s. And Lisa currently leads several taxonomy teams responsible for powering content discovery across Amazon.com. And this includes Kindle, Prime Video, and US Books, and more. Lisa will share a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. So welcome, Lisa, and I am going to turn it over to you right now. So take it away, take the controls, and have at it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Laura, for that great introduction. And hello, Scott. So thank you very much. As you say, I've done a little bit of everything. I've been in the content world since the 90s, which seems sort of archaeological in and of itself these days. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So I'll be giving this talk as well at Henry Stewart Dam. It's in San Diego, which will be very exciting. So if you're hearing it after that, hello again. If you're hearing it before, you're getting a nice preview. And if you're just looking at it on demand, it'll hopefully bring you back to that nice place with beer and tacos. So that'll be good times. So the 7 circles of metadata hell, and it's really about staffing and governing your dam to avoid all sorts of terrible things happening. A lot of the things I'm going to speak to are things that you as content professionals will already know about, but as you know, with this kind of thing, it's really, you need to have something to take away, to give to your leadership so that they can go back and be like, oh, well, these companies do this, so we should fund that too, so that we don't end up in a much worse state. So again, here's a little bit more about me. I think you've already heard a lot from the introduction, but I am at Amazon right now. I've been here for just about 3 years. I've been in a couple different roles involving content and knowledge management, things like that, but I currently lead a lot of teams doing a lot of stuff, which is very cool, though also a very big challenge. And we do run into a lot of those problems that smaller companies have, but we run into them at scale. So that's always I'll say interesting, since it's not always good or bad. It's interesting. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I am also a certified beer judge, so I can speak to that as well, which is always important after a long day of trying to solve some naughty content problems. So what I'm going to talk about today is really some best practices, again, things that you guys will know about. Like, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's giving you hopefully something you can take back to your leadership and again, use to try to be like, we need to fund this, or we need better software, or we need a different approach, or we need to have processes. So again, it's always people, processes, technology, but really thinking about how you can sort of strategize around these things. So I don't get to talk too much about Amazon specific things because Amazon is very, 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 very secretive about everything. But again, I will say if I run into you in person somewhere at a conference, happy to share a little bit over a drink. So I've got some really good stories to tell, but it's again, they're all kind of a little bit secretive. But we're definitely going to talk about things that have happened to me at other companies, things that I have seen maybe here, but we'll be a little bit vague about those. But definitely some of these scenarios you're going to see are going to be familiar to a lot of you. So why only 7 circles? Dante had 9 circles, and I think this was even something Scott was like, hey, what about that? And really, first, alliteration, it just reads nicely. And secondly, brevity. Can't talk for well, as much as I would love to talk forever about content and about all the good things around it, it's something I don't have time to do. So got to make sure you guys kind of get in and out and get the good stuff. So really, I'm going to come back to this a couple of times. It's, we want to think about solutions. It's really all about that governance, the investment, the people. And again, you guys know you have to spend a little money to save money in the long run. That's not something your finance people want to hear, but that's the truth of it. And as much as we can kind of hammer that home, the better shape you'll be in. So we'll talk about circle one, when you have no metadata of any kind. And you've all been here. You have tons of assets out there that don't have any metadata, and this is probably how you feel. And then you're just going to have a little bit of a sad when this happens. And again, I had sort of toyed with, I should have some good screenshots of things without metadata. And then I was like, no, everyone has seen that. No one wants to see that, sort of hammered home again. We'll have fun, Grumpy Cat and things like that to talk about it. But I will say I've been in, again, very large global companies where people thought it was just fine to upload thousands of assets that have no metadata of any kind, and there's often good intentions behind that. People are like, oh, well, we put the files in the right place. And you're like, good, but that's not the end of the story. But again, you have to think about, why did they think that was okay, and drill down into that a little bit. And a lot of times it's because, again, people have good intentions and they think, oh, well, everything is just attached to the file. And you're like, well, no, not really. Some things might be, but again, they don't necessarily, and again, they could be an agency, they could be someone who's editing images for you, they could be the marketing people in your company who just don't know that you need to have rights metadata, or if that's how you're managing it, or you need to know where you can use this in the world. Did you actually buy a license for it? There's all those things that you're probably going to have metadata for, or you're probably going to need metadata for, but it's just not there. And when you have things that have been sitting in your system for a while, or on someone's hard drive for a while, no one remembers where they came from. And so, again, we've all been there, but we really have to think about making sure you have processes in place, and really education, and a real interest in making this better with people. So you have to explain the problem sometimes to people who aren't going to get it, and make sure, again, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, that their leadership knows, and that they're making it a thing people want to do. You have to really incentivize people to do the right thing. You can't just sort of expect that it is going to happen, even though that would be wonderful. But again, you don't want to hit people over the head too much with education about what you need to get in your dam and why, but you do want to make sure that that's something that is revisited early and often, and that it's a really lightweight thing for people to just be able to grab. And again, I'm not speaking to any kind of specific system, because there's going to be different solutions out there, and I feel like 80% of people always feel like they have the wrong technology solution for whatever their particular use case is, or whatever their particular problem to solve is. But a lot of times when you sort of peel back the layers, it's really about, what are the internal processes. You may still have a strange UI that you don't want to work with, or you may still have other issues around just sort of a difficult to use system. But at the end of the day, it's always worth taking a step back and saying, is there a process people don't understand? And is there a mental model people don't understand? If they don't understand the why you need to get the metadata in the system, that's going to sort of keep leading to larger and larger problems. So again, sort of evangelize early and often for your dam. And then circle two, we have automated metadata. We've solved it all, because there's, the machines will save us. And that's, this is where we end up with that. So we know, like, it doesn't work. It's there are things you can automate, and I will use an example here from a large e-commerce company that may or may not be the one I currently work for, but there have been different sort of different internal approaches to try to automate some things, whether it's about again, how you're finding things on left nav, or whether you're looking at, like, maybe a video. How can you categorize it? Again, you're trying to categorize things at scale. The problem is, as you guys know, working with content, you can do some neat things in terms of bucketizing things at a really high level, but when you do try to really automate things, you end up with so many things in the wrong place, or things that just don't have the correct context, or things where maybe you have bits and pieces that are right, but they still end up in the wrong place. And again, this may or may not be an example that's near and dear to my heart at the moment, but whenever you have particularly saucy paranormal romance things turning up in your children's books, don't do that. No one wants that. So it's, or maybe your teenagers might want that. I have a teenage son, so they might want that, but we shouldn't be giving it to them. So you do have to really look out for things like that. Anytime you're automating things and there's not a sort of review by a person, again, as you know, bad things happen. There's absolutely a role for some level of automation. You want to be able to automate, again, think about it from a process perspective. You want to automate the really painful processes. You don't necessarily want to automate the information itself, the content itself, because when you don't have that human review by an expert is when you really run into problems. And again, that sort of goes back to our first circle a little bit, where just because you have something doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It may be, but sometimes it can get you into even more complicated problems that you didn't anticipate. So, and there's always going to be someone somewhere in your company banging the drum for this, because it sounds like a great idea, and in a lot of ways it is. You can certainly do certain things at scale and get a certain point ahead, but you still have to come in and, again, kind of be hardcore about your processes and say, but we need to know when you have human review on this. We need to know who needs to do that review, and we need to know how often they need to do that. So again, automation can do a lot of really good things, but it can't solve everything. And anytime people think it does, what I've typically seen happen in companies where this happens is there's a sort of circle around this, and that it's, oh, we're going to automate it all now. We don't need these people anymore. And then they lay a lot of people off. And then sort of 6 to 12 to 18 months later, they come back to those people and they need to hire them all back, because they've discovered that actually it didn't work so well the other way, and they've ended up spending a lot of time and money in the meantime that they thought they were saving, but not so much. So you can always, go back to that example and say, what problem are we trying to solve when we want to add in automation? If we're automating a process, that makes sense. If you're automating something to get to a certain level of completion, that makes sense. But you have to know that it will not, the machines are not here to save us. They're just here to do what we tell them to do, and they're not always very smart. So you still need that human review. So number 3, user-supplied metadata. Again, good intentions. We love good intentions, and we love our users, but that's what gets us into having issues around our metadata. And again, this comes back to governance. It's great if you have a really robust sort of crowdsourcing program, whether that's internal or external, where you do give people some kind of incentive to come and add that metadata. But you certainly start to get into things where you'll see some strange microgenres emerging, none of which have any kind of sort of reconciliation. You'll start to see, rabbit and rabbits and, sort of rabbit fun and all kinds of variations on a theme. And again, if you don't have someone actually going through, it's not necessarily like the automation, but someone may just not have time to go through and try to sort of collapse these all together. That's one system. Well, that's one area you get into. You get all these folksonomies, which again can absolutely have their place, but you do need to make sure again that there's governance around that there's a real program around that. And I think that's a theme you see throughout any kind of DAM or content implementation. Is this is not a one and done thing. This is an ongoing program. Content is not just for Christmas, it's for life, and you have to keep feeding the beast and kind of making sure that what you have still makes sense. And again, I'll speak to another issue I've had at a previous employer long ago, and this was actually a really cool example of doing some crowdsourcing. Especially, you see it a lot in academia or museums when you're trying to get people to add some rich metadata to things where you just don't have the time, money, resources to make it happen. You do get a lot of really interesting data, but you have to then go back and fact check it. You don't necessarily have, what you have may not actually be accurate. And I've seen some things where, especially when you're working with something that's very technical. I worked for a super cool archives that focused on medical history, had amazing stuff, but when you do sort of open the floodgates to things, whether that's sort of transcribing, anything like that, you do get, so you get some unusual things that pop up, and some of those are great, and some of those are not so great, and you have to, again, then spend more time going back and trying to iron those things out. And if that's not something you originally budgeted for, whether from a time perspective or just from a resourcing perspective, you're going to end up with some strange stuff. And as you know, at the end of the day, that means you have things that are not necessarily findable, or things that are not popping up where you expect them, or sort of things that are just getting sort of interpreted in a strange way because you had you sort of let your users sort of have free reign. And again, in most cases, you're not actually letting them have free reign, but it's one of those things, again, where to upper management, and upper management's not always the enemy. A lot of them are super cool and want to help, and that's always good to really make sure you've got those advocates for your system. But it sounds like you're getting something for free, and that's great, but you are getting some stuff for free, but then, again, you still have to make sure they understand that, yeah, we have this, but we need to then add a layer on top of that to make sure that it's clean, that it's accurate, and that it's really making sure that we can get this stuff in the hands of the people who want it. So it's great, but it's not a solve in and of itself. So stale metadata, this is also a bad thing. And again, in what may or may not be my current role, this can cause a lot of big problems. So you know, you're like super excited that there is metadata, but then you like, one thing that we have a lot of sort of trouble with, especially when you're working for a global company, is sort of semantic shift in things. So something that might have been a perfectly acceptable term to use for anything is suddenly offensive now, and not even necessarily suddenly, like there's been a shift over time, but if your metadata used a word that was acceptable, say 30 years ago, and there are places that have 30-year-old metadata, and now it's something we would never use, you have to think, oh, we should probably recategorize everything. And you know, that's a more extreme example where you have things that go from being sort of, oh, they're fine, to super offensive, but they're just anything like that. The longer it just sits there without having any kind of review date or having any kind of sort of life cycle check-in, the more you can get into these problems. And for some of that, it's really straightforward. Like your metadata may just be sitting there and you haven't even updated, say, a date that you did, you know, maybe you did renew a license for something, you just didn't update it. It could be that you are still well within your rights to use an image, but no one knows. So that's certainly an issue. I've seen other places as well where you have sort of partial updates, but not everything. People don't know whether or not you can use things. And then you just sort of get back into that sort of administrative, oh, well, no one really knows. Is this really giving us value? And that's where people, when people start to sort of doubt the, either doubt the accuracy of your metadata, or kind of feel like, oh, well, it might be right, but maybe I can just use the one on my desktop. Again, you have to really make sure people have faith in the system. Having the metadata there isn't enough, especially when it gets old. I mean, and I know it's actually a dream world to think, oh, it'd be great if we could update the metadata on everything every 6 to 12 months. That's never going to happen, just because we don't have the time, money, people to do that. But you do want to make sure you can set some dates. You can do some of these things in bulk, and you know, keep an eye on how people are searching for your things, in whether that's, you know, in your local office, in another region. Sometimes these shifts in meanings are really obvious, and sometimes they're a little more subtle. So again, it can be anything from just sort of keyword metadata to that kind of administrative metadata that you really need to make sure stays up to date. It's easy enough to just think we did it once and you know, it's all fine, but it's certainly something that is an ongoing task. And again, you people know that, but your management may not know that you need to keep doing that. So it's important to keep it fresh. Otherwise, a lot of different bad things can happen. So moving on, too much metadata. And this sounds like, how could you ever have this problem? I mean, you know, the more we have to describe something, the better. I mean, this is great. However, sometimes too much metadata leads to actually not enough metadata, or the wrong metadata, and it also really depends on what the system you have right now can actually use. I've seen this happen in when you're migrating from one system to another, where there's just a mismatch of what it can and can't display in the new system. Or the biggest thing I've seen is, again, in a previous life, I worked somewhere where there were 43 required metadata fields on each item. So, surprise, no one entered those 43 required metadata fields because no one had time to do that, and it was an entirely manual process. So you ended up with a lot of things that actually had no metadata, and it turned out that the system in question didn't even utilize all those fields. So it's you have to, again, really ask what's actually important, and that's when you want to go back to your sort of stable of users and to be like, what do you actually use? What's actually important? Again, it's so important to really go back to your users, make sure that you can advocate for not just for your system and your program, but for them, because they're the ones who are keeping this going every day. And if they're not using half of these, you have to kind of, or sometimes even more, you have to go back and have a rethink about how you want to get it in there, what's actually required for your system. And this is something that's going to be extensible in the long term, because you don't want to undersell yourself, but you also want to make sure that you have the right number of fields there. They don't all need to be required. And again, a lot of times you'll end up with, you know, thinking about the crowdsourcing example too, if you end up with 47 keywords about something, that's not particularly useful. That's too many. That's telling you that a lot of people have ideas about something, but you need to really get back and have some governance around that and say, well, actually, this would be a lot more findable if we were a lot more sort of very specific about what we're calling this, and this is the controlled vocabulary we're going to use, and that's always, again, a nice solution. I'm a big controlled vocabulary fan, so always want to try to move back in that direction. But again, I think it always sounds great to have more, but more is not always the way you want to go. And then again, this sort of builds on the last one. Your metadata doesn't play nicely with whatever you have. And this happens a lot. You know, the vendor will absolutely swear, no, it's fine. It's all just going to migrate over. It's, you know, you won't have to worry about a thing. You won't have to retag anything. It's going to maintain all that data when you go from one to the other. It's going to be fantastic. And again, I know a lot of great vendors out there. This actually does happen, but I think we've all been in that situation where things just mysteriously disappeared in the migration, and a lot of times it is the metadata, or you're missing a big chunk of it, and suddenly you have to go back in and retag a lot of things. So you're definitely going to be in that situation where you had something that was working pretty well, and now you're in a situation where you have something that's not working very well at all. And I've been through this a lot of times where, you know, you're being told, well, we have to change from this system to the other, but the new system is going to give you a lot more functionality. This is going to happen. But then you actually go into it and you're like, oh, I can no longer search for the 3 fields that were my kind of day-to-day. I have to reset things up. Oh, it still doesn't find those. And then you have to go in and figure out what's happening there. So again, I think the way to avoid this problem is really having the people in the room who are going to be using the stuff day to day, who are the end users. A lot of times when those, and this is sort of my hobby horse, a lot of times when those purchasing decisions are being made around what you're buying, it's people 2 and 3 levels up who don't actually use this day to day, who are, yes, they're writing the checks, but they may not necessarily know what are our day to day use cases and why are those important. And this is especially important when it comes to the metadata, because a lot of times, and again, I say a lot of times because it's happened to me a lot of times. I hope it has not happened to you a lot of times, but you know, you will be told everything is transferred over, and everything did transfer over from a sort of image or video perspective, but you lost all the metadata, and that's not a situation you want to be in, or it's in a different place and you can't find it. So long story short, have the right people in the room. You may still run into these problems, but the more you can kind of get ahead of it and really make it clear with your vendor what's really important, and to know that, you know, if we don't have these 8 fields transfer over, this is going to be ending our relationship prematurely. They don't want to hear that. They want to make sure it's going to work for you. So again, it's having the right people with the right authority in the room to make those decisions. And this is one of my favorites because it covers so many different things, where you just have mystery policies. And this goes back to a little bit of what I talked about before in terms of, you know, do people know that your system exists? Do they know that they need to use it? Do they know why it's going to make their lives easier? And do they know what they have to do to really get the most out of it? And, you know, here you go. A lot of times you have these great standards. You've thought about them. They are just the best. They sound like they're really going to keep everything up to date. They sound like you're going to be getting some really powerful data. It's going to be fantastic. But if no one knows about them, or if they know about them but they don't care, you have to really think about how you're going to socialize these things, how you have to explain to people who maybe don't even know they have to do anything that these things are important. And there's a couple of different ways you can get at this, and I think one of my favorite examples is again, in a previous life, we had some, you know, really like bang on lists of metadata that we had to have vendors apply to every item that they gave us, well, or less vendors, but more agencies, but nothing actually stopped them from getting paid if they didn't do it. So again, you kind of want to circle back with people looking after your contracts. You want to make sure, or your legal folks, whoever is kind of the person with the power in that relationship, to make sure that if this is something else you need them to supply, it's not good enough that they've made a great image of a dog or whatever, but you need to kind of make sure that you're driving the right behaviors and you're not making it hard for people. You're actually hopefully kind of making it fun, but they need to know that that is an expectation. And again, for people internally, if they need to get trained on the system, make sure that's something they do. I know a lot of people will tend to go for sort of a gamification approach. Now, that may or may not work depending on your kind of company, but you want to make it easy for people to use, but you really want to make sure they know why this stuff is important, and that certainly you should not For example, you should be able to illustrate with an especially bad example. So if you work for a big pharmaceutical company, just saying, you may not want to go on Google Images and just grab a random person's 8x10 and put that in your system and use it in all sorts of what I'll call sensitive ads around the world. That's not how you do that. So you want to make sure that you have people who know how these things work, and that just because something is in your system doesn't mean that you can necessarily use them, that all the right steps have been followed. So you need to make sure people understand your processes, whether that's internal documentation, whether that's ongoing training, or whether there are just sort of fun things in the system that help guide people through it. They need to know that these standards exist for a reason. They're going to help make their jobs easier, and hopefully that they're going to save some money in the long run. So you're going to kind of pick your audience for those different things. But it's definitely something to think about. And again, governance, investment, people, these are always the things that are going to help keep you from ending up in, again, a sort of deeper and deeper circle of metadata hell. So very quickly, these are some solutions. You want to make sure that your metadata has some standards and that those standards will help support its extensibility, its portability, that you do have a regular review built in, that you really think about what your global partners need, whether they're people you work with day to day or people who see this stuff once a year. Always have some controlled vocabulary, because you want to really make sure people are calling things the right things, and that you can make it easy for them. They can just select something from a list, and you don't have to really you don't even have to really think about it. So again, think about how you want to incentivize good behavior. You really want to make it easy for people, also make it fun for people as much as you can. So get out there and make sure that you have standards, they're easily communicated, and that people know that they're there for a reason and they want to help. These are kind of the pillars I always come back to. You have, the people, the governance, the investment, the technology, the mechanisms, and the communication. I'm not going to read through the slide because there's a lot of words on this one, but this is one you can take away later, have a look at. And I think, it's not just people, processes, technology. Those are the main pillars, but you also have to think about what's underneath that. How are you continuing to invest in that? How are you continuing to communicate what's going on? Remember that it's a program. It's going on and on. It's never ending. And, that's not something that people necessarily know outside of your core group, or if you're a lone arranger, your core you. So you really want to make sure people know what you're up to. And again, always get back to that governance. Make sure people understand governance, that it can be flexible. And again, mechanisms are great. You want things to be repeatable. You want things to be predictable. And weird things are going to happen. That's okay, but you want to make sure that you have sort of predictable responses to them. And again, the people and the technology will depend on what your particular use case is, but you want to make sure you have the right things for both of those cases. You may need something that has a lot of people staffing it. And I will always say, err on the side of having more full-time staff. It's just a better experience. You have that institutional knowledge. People can really get out there and evangelize for the system. I know it's hard to make those business cases to staff them, but it's also, like, as everyone who's been in this field knows, it's not nice when you're always having to be a contractor unless that's what you want, but it's nice to have that full-time, that sort of full-time flexibility, and to know that you're there really kind of running a tight ship. And with that said, I will just go into thank you very much for the chance. I am always on Twitter. I'm often complaining about metadata, or bad metadata, not good metadata. And also I'm hiring. So if anyone out there is a taxonomist or a taxonomy manager looking for a new role, feel free to reach out to me and I could put you in touch with some folks. So thank you again.
Well, the first question that pops to me is it a remote position?
That is a question I get asked a lot. Unfortunately, no, but they do provide relocation to Seattle.
Okay. Just thought I'd clear that one out of the way.
Absolutely. It is a popular question.
Yeah. One question that leaps out at me, but, the stale content and then too much content, it's like,
yeah.
How do you future-proof it? Because I think the mistake that I see is people saying, this could get stale, so let's just add a bunch more. And that's where you get into 4 and 5. So what is your strategy or your favorite technique for future-proofing it so that you don't have some of these offensive terms?
I think one thing there is actually just future-proofing, just having that as a thought in the background, really trying to do that research before you determine what the terms are you're using, especially thinking about it from a controlled vocabulary perspective. I think you want to think about those things as really living in your system for a long time, maybe longer than some other things, and really trying to make sure that you've done your due diligence. And again, these things will still have shifts, that's okay, but really trying to think about what which of the terms are kind of a pillar in your system and that you know are going to be used for a long time, and really having that thought when you're doing that research. And I think research is such a big component that can often be overlooked in this field. Again, we all know we're doing it, but it's not something necessarily that people up above know that they're paying for. And it's so important to make sure that you are getting some of these things right and that you're able to really back those things up. And I think, again, involving more people, although kind of the right size, depending on your org, in the decision is really helpful in my current role. And this is one thing I am allowed to say. We do have a really rigorous process of code review and design review. So as soon as we have a data model, we have someone else look at it if it's going to be a significant change. And that really helps just to get another person's perspective, to get some global expertise in there. That is something that I think really adds another dimension to your future proofing.
Okay.
So regarding bad metadata, what are some examples? You don't have to mention organization or anything. That one that Laura's heard about, I've talked about this one before, doing a migration from a desktop database with FileMaker, I believe, into the DAM system my company was managing at the time. For publication date, it was not really a date field. Values like CBOB.
Oh, that's brilliant. I would say too, like I'll say in publishing, I've also seen some weird things again from previous roles where sometimes you do get something where it is just someone's note that they appended, and it's not a particularly useful note or a particularly meaningful one. But I've certainly also seen things like found on Google, and that was the only information that you had, and you're like, oh, okay, that's great. Or I think one of my favorite things I've seen too in another company is we bought this. There was no date. It was just complete free text. And you're like, oh, okay, from, and and again, in some of those cases, you can find a little bit of embedded metadata in the image, which can help. But if that hadn't been there, and sometimes if you work for a big company that doesn't care, not the one I work for now, but ones I've worked for in the past, they wait until the cease and desist letter comes from Getty Images or whomever else, and they deal with it then. So that's always nice.
So what would you recommend for a situation like, the CBOB sort of situation where an employee or a contractor is asked to put something in the system, but there's something that's theoretically required but is not knowable to them at the time? How would you mark that, using a controlled vocabulary, and how would you rectify that down the road? Yeah,
that's a really interesting question, and I've certainly dealt with that a little bit in the past, where you had a sort of placeholder text you could put in that you could easily search on. And again, that was something where everyone who used the system was aware of it and used the same one and understood that this was the standard. And it would also flag things for the person eventually going in to clean them up. And the nice thing is, in this one particular instance I'm thinking of, the system would just sort of send all of those things to a staging environment versus pushing them out. I've also worked with a lot of things that don't have any kind of staging environment. Everything's just live. It's amazing. But I think that's something where, again, if you can build in that sort of check step, that can really help. But it has to be something that's recognized and used by everyone who uses it. Otherwise, it's a nice idea, but then if people aren't playing along, you have to kind of get out there and make sure that happens.
One of the things that I've seen, in particularly with large organizations, is that there's kind of a lack of empathy when it comes to metadata. It's just that, okay, I'm commissioned to put this up there. I've got to put something in. Findability be damned. Pun intended.
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
How would you do that from an organizational standpoint to see that, okay, well, it's not just about you putting it up. It's about the entire organization, our customers, if it's facing them, our vendors, if it's facing them. How do we make it findable for them, and how do we pull back? I think that probably the answer is going to come to hire more librarians, right? But
that's always nice.
People, I got to get this off my plate. I'm going to put something in there, whether it makes sense to anybody else or not. I mean, how that has to come from probably some high-level offices. I mean,
yeah, and I think that goes back to the idea of having that sort of high-level, important advocate for your system where they can really go out and be a cheerleader for it and explain why it's important. I've also run into that, again, at a previous company where we were able to mitigate some of that through having really fun training that people liked doing, and it was a very short video message, but people got to know, even if they were physically in a different office, different country, some of the people working on the system and why it was important, and it was just really well done. Again, you have to have the resources to do this where you have a sort of big global training video firm that can come out and film these things for you. That's not something everyone has, or even most people have, but I think being able to put a face on some of the other users really helped. And I think, again, when you think about it as a sort of empathy, you know, if they can understand that this is not just something they're doing to check a box, this is something they're doing because it's making someone else's job easier, I think that can help drive that. But again, you kind of need to have either a way in through training or a way in through sort of lunch and learn or something, some way that you can actually kind of get a person in front of the other people doing it so they know why it's important. Or again, you can have someone who's just going to come down and say, this is part of your job. If you don't do this right, you get fired. So you have a sort of carrot and stick in there, I think. And again, different things are going to work better for different organizations. But I love if you can just get out there and talk to people so that they understand this is important. This is going to make your life easier, someone else's life easier. And I think if people do get that sense, they can they'll eventually play nicely with it. But there's a lot of potential solves there, but it really depends on kind of the resources you have at hand. And again, if you have that high level advocate for the system, that always makes your life easier. So.
Okay, one final question because we have to wrap up.
Sure.
And hopefully this will be an easy question for you to answer, kind of a softball, but I really like what you said about having empathy for the user. What role does diversity have on the team of people who are involved in creating the metadata to begin with?
Oh, sure, that is hugely important, and that's something that I love my current team for, because we do have this really diverse group of folks from all over the world who do have these very different perspectives, and that's actually something we really think about a lot, where you want to bring diverse perspectives and you actually want to kind of disconfirm your own beliefs and make sure that you are thinking more broadly, you're getting out of your own head. And you know, there's so much data out there on how, you know, the more diverse teams are, the more successful they are, and they make more money, and that's always something that can help drive that as a business goal. But I mean, and that's something I'm very passionate about, is having a much more diverse team, especially when you're dealing with something that comes down to language and description. You know, you want to get outside of wherever you've come from. You want that perspective too, but you want to make sure that you're banging it up against sort of other people's ideas and experiences. And again, that's what I love about our current design reviews, is they're global, and they really get people from all over very different backgrounds to think about these things, and to think about it from a user's perspective too, whether that's out in the wild world or even like an internal user's perspective. You really want to think about, what am I not thinking of, and to bring that you know, those more diverse perspectives into that design review, into that however you're data modeling. I think it's just so important. And I think too, especially as librarians, it's easy for me to get inside my own head, and I love to make sure I've got other people who are inside their own heads but willing to share. So I think that's you know, information professionals want to get the right information in front of people, and when you get more than one head together, I think you're always going to be more successful.
I love it. It's like, go figure, empathy and diversity can improve findability.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I love that as a tagline. I want that on a t-shirt. That would be fantastic.
Go ahead, use that for the DAM conference. And I'm thinking about all the people there in San Diego who...
I may well do. If I could do it in time, I'll do it. But if not, it'll be there at a future conference. That's a great line.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.